For a long time, the Amazon was spoken of as if it were a world without footsteps, a place too vast, too unruly, too saturated with heat and storms and shadows to ever allow more than scattered wanderers to pass through it. The early stories described it as a wilderness, untouched by human hands, a realm where nature reigned without interruption, where nothing permanent could survive beneath the restless canopy. It was an idea repeated so often that it hardened into certainty, even though certainty had no place in a land that hides itself so well. But when you drift slowly above the treetops, watching the endless green shift and breathe like a single living body, it becomes difficult to accept the old belief. The forest is too deliberate, its patterns are too steady, its quiet too heavy, as if something beneath the leaves is holding its breath. Explorers once saw only what the surface allowed them to see, and that was never the whole story. They carried memories of ruined empires carved from stone, so they assumed any place without monuments must have no history at all. It was comforting, in a way, to imagine the Amazon as empty. A blank world invites no responsibility. A silent world asks no questions. Yet the silence here feels less like absence and more like a door that was closed gently long ago. What they thought was untouched wilderness may have been a room carefully sealed by time, its walls made of vines, its floor layered with centuries of fallen leaves. New eyes would eventually realize that emptiness can be an illusion, especially in a place where life grows faster than memory can fade. The canopy hides more than shadows. It hides roads. It hides shapes. It hides the faint echoes of decisions made by people who understood this land in ways we are only beginning to grasp. Their cities did not vanish because they were small or fragile. They vanished because the forest is patient, and it protects by covering, not revealing. And so the question arises, quiet but persistent. If this world was never empty, then why did we believe it was? The next steps lead toward the people who first claimed to see what lay beneath the leaves and why their voices were dismissed. When the first Europeans drifted down the wide, gleaming arteries of the Amazon, they expected hardship, silence, and small, scattered bands of people living at the mercy of the forest. What they recorded instead unsettled them. Francisco de Orellana and his men wrote of riverbanks lined with settlements so large they seemed to stretch beyond the horizon. They described plazas busy with trade, houses rising in multiple tiers, networks of causeways threading one community to another. Fires glowed at night in numbers impossible to ignore. The men, exhausted and half-starved, still found the presence of countless others impossible to deny. Yet when they returned to their own world, these accounts were met not with curiosity, but with ridicule. Rivals branded them liars, desperate to embellish their failures with fantasies. Scholars insisted no great civilization could flourish in soil believed too poor, under skies believed too unforgiving. Each dismissal made the next one easier, until disbelief became safer than inquiry. And so the journals that once pulsed with life slowly detached from memory, treated as exaggerations born from fever and fear. Still, there is something peculiar about lies that match each other so closely. Different men, separated by rank and temperament, recorded similar sights. Well-organized towns, agricultural fields carved into elegant patterns, and people who moved along the river with confidence and purpose. Their words were clear. It was the world that refused to listen. Time aided this denial. By the time later expeditions followed the same river, the jungle had already begun its quiet work. Villages once alive had collapsed into soil. Roads had softened into forest paths. Fields had blurred into a green that looked eternal. With no ruins to point toward, it was easier to declare the first witnesses mistaken. Easier to erase entire societies with a sentence than to question the assumptions behind it. But the contradiction lingers, steady and unsettling. How could so many detailed accounts have emerged, only to vanish from the narrative? If those early chroniclers saw what they claimed, then the river once carried far more than silence. And if great cities once lined these banks, another question drifts forward, slow and inevitable. What force swept them away so completely that only the forest remembered where they stood? The Amazon does not simply surround anything placed within it. It absorbs, it breathes over it. It draws it slowly back into the deep green tide as if reclaiming what was briefly borrowed. In a world where vines can split timber within months, where rain falls in dense sheets that loosen soil, and where roots push upward with quiet insistence, nothing stands still for long. A house abandoned one season becomes a mound the next. A road left untended dissolves into a soft trail swallowed by leaves. What begins as a structure ends as mulch, then memory, then nothing at all. The forest behaves almost like a living archive that erases while it protects. Humidity quickens decay. Insects reduce beams to dust. Acidic soil devours anything left on the surface. Even stone, where it existed, weathers faster here than in gentler climates. Floodwaters shift channels unpredictably, washing away entire settlements without leaving a scar. For late-night listeners, this sense of inevitability settles in like a slow tide. In this place, permanence is an illusion. Yet for all its hunger, the jungle never manages to erase entirely. Beneath the layer of roots and fallen leaves lie soils that should not exist, enriched by human hands. Mounds appear beneath the canopy in geometric shapes, too precise to be natural. Faint lines emerge in satellite images, tracing the ghosts of causeways long hidden from view. Even the forest composition itself whispers of cultivation. Patterns of useful trees clustered as carefully as any ancient orchard. These traces complicate the silence. They reveal a contradiction the surface tries to hide. The jungle consumed the visible world, but the land beneath it still remembers. Early explorers could not see these clues, blinded by the density of the canopy and the speed with which the forest reclaims its ground. Their mistakes were not always born of arrogance. Sometimes the evidence simply lay too deep for the tools of the age. But the clues were there all along, waiting for a moment when someone could peel back the leaves without disturbing the soil. And so the question grows, steady and patient. If the jungle hides everything from untrained eyes, what finally allowed us to see beneath its vast green veil and discover the cities it had been guarding for centuries? For centuries, the Amazon's greatest advantage was its secrecy. The canopy formed a shield so dense that even sunlight struggled to reach the forest floor in clear lines. From above, the world looked smooth and uninterrupted, a vast green ocean hiding anything that lay beneath its surface. For a long time, that was enough to keep its deeper stories invisible. But then, almost quietly, new tools arrived. Tools that did not ask the forest to reveal itself, but simply passed through its leaves as if they were not there at all. LiDAR was the first of these instruments. A beam of light returning with memories of the ground instead of the treetops. Where eyes saw nothing but foliage, the scans revealed straight lines, perfect circles, raised platforms, and traces of canals arranged with startling intention. Drone mapping followed, gliding above the canopy in slow, patient sweeps, gathering layers of information no explorer on foot could have collected. Multispectral imagery added even more depth, detecting patterns of vegetation that hinted at ancient cultivation, while soil analysis uncovered zones enriched in ways that defied natural explanation. What emerged from these technologies was not a scattering of isolated habitations, but something far larger. Archaeologists stared at their screens in silence, realizing they were no longer dealing with small forest settlements. They were looking at networks, clusters of cities connected by engineered roads, each shaped by people who understood this landscape with a sophistication history had not credited them with. The jungle had not erased their work. It had only hidden it long enough for us to develop the tools capable of seeing it. The emotional shift was subtle but profound. A world believed empty now appeared full. A place labelled untouched revealed the faint geometry of intention. It felt less like a discovery, and more like the unlocking of a sealed vault, a slow unveiling of stories the forest had guarded for centuries. And with the veil lifted, even slightly, anticipation took hold. Because if these were only the first shapes emerging from beneath the canopy, then what else waited in the layers still untouched? The next chapters follow those lines and patterns signs left behind by the people whose cities were rediscovered the moment we finally learned how to see. The first LiDAR maps appeared almost like apparitions. At a glance, they looked like soft grey clouds hovering above a darker background, nothing more than static caught in a digital net. But when archaeologists leaned closer, the clouds began to separate into lines, thin, deliberate, unmistakably straight. Then circles emerged, too perfect to be natural, followed by long avenues that ran with such confidence across the terrain that disbelief was the only sensible first reaction. The jungle had hidden these forms for centuries, and now, all at once, they were surfacing like memories rising from deep water. As more scans arrived, the images became stranger still. Rectangular plazas arranged with sharp symmetry, terraces carved in quiet tiers, earthworks shaped like defensive walls, zigzagging with purpose across the forest floor. None of it matched the old belief that only small, scattered communities lived here. These shapes were not improvisations. They were planned, measured, designed by people who understood geometry as fluently as they understood the river's rhythms. Interpretations formed quickly, but none felt sufficient. Some experts saw ceremonial centers aligned to celestial markers. Others saw agricultural hubs arranged to manage seasonal floods. Still others suggested these were proto-cities, fragments of a network so expansive that only the smallest edges had yet been revealed. Every new pass of the scanner widened the mystery. It was as if the forest, reluctant at first, had begun surrendering its secrets piece by piece. The emotional weight grew with each discovery. Researchers spoke of the eerie beauty in watching entire landscapes appear where only blank foliage had once been. Roads stretched in straight lines that defied the chaos expected of a rainforest. Plazas formed constellations on the ground, echoing patterns far too organized to be accidental. These were not random ruins. They were the outlines of a world thought impossible. And yet, something deeper lingered beneath the excitement, a subtle awareness that these shapes were only the first layer. If such precision existed in the areas already mapped, then what lay hidden in the regions still untouched by LiDAR? What larger designs might wait beyond the edges of the scanned terrain? That question leads naturally forward, toward the next revelation, the moment when isolated shapes transformed into the unmistakable traces of a vast, interconnected system. The next surprise came not from the shapes of plazas or the outlines of ancient terraces, but from the faint, unwavering lines that cut across the landscape with startling confidence. When the scans were first analyzed, some researchers thought these straight paths must be modern intrusions, logging roads, perhaps, or survey cuts made in recent decades. But as the data sharpened, the truth settled in. These were ancient causeways, elevated highways running for kilometers through terrain so unpredictable that even modern builders hesitate to cross it. They were engineered with a precision that felt almost out of place in a world imagined as wild and unplanned. Some rose above seasonal floodwaters, maintaining their form through months of relentless rain. Others ran in perfect alignment between distant settlements, linking plazas, mounds, and earthworks that had once been part of a shared world. These were not trails carved by wandering groups. They were deliberate arteries of movement, wide enough for processions, trade caravans, or coordinated labor teams passing between cities that were never meant to stand alone. Each new road expanded the vision of what this region once held. A single settlement implied a village. A cluster suggested a town. But highways, broad, elevated, enduring, hinted at something far larger. Political coordination across distances, a shared sense of identity, and a capacity for labor that required planning measured not in years, but in generations. The old assumptions about small, isolated groups dissolved as fast as the lines appeared on the maps. Some scholars began to suspect these causeways formed part of a continental network, a web of trade reaching far beyond the forest's edge. Shells from distant coasts, stones from remote highlands, and shards of ceramics found hundreds of miles from their origins supported the idea that movement here was not chaotic, but orchestrated. The forest had swallowed the roads, but the traces remained, whispering of a world far more connected than anyone imagined. And beneath the wonder lurked the quiet mystery. How did people build such vast, straight highways, without metal tools, without beasts of burden, and in an environment that constantly tries to erase all human effort? The answer lies not in the roads themselves, but in the people who walked them, the populations whose presence shaped this hidden world more profoundly than the jungle ever could. As more patterns emerged from the scans, a deeper realization began to take shape, one that unsettled even seasoned archaeologists. The settlements were not isolated pockets of life scattered along the river. They stretched in clusters, in networks, in layered zones of habitation that suggested not thousands of people but millions. The forest we see today, seemingly untouched, once held a population comparable to some of the great centers of the ancient world. Homes stood along raised roads, fields and gardens spread outward in careful spirals. Water systems shimmered in the wet season, guiding floods into reservoirs and ponds designed with quiet ingenuity. It is strange to imagine such density in a place now governed by silence, yet the evidence persists. Fragments of terraces shaped by many hands, soils enriched beyond natural limits, and patterns of vegetation still responding to choices made centuries ago. These traces hint at neighborhoods filled with voices. Children running between houses, artisans carving wood under shaded roofs, traders unloading boats at communal plazas, all of it alive once. All of it carried by people who moved through their days with a sense of belonging to something larger than a single village. But the jungle, patient as ever, reclaimed it all. Streets thickened into forest paths. Houses became depressions filled with leaves. Even communal spaces dissolved into undergrowth. Without stone to resist time, the imprint of daily life faded until only subtle marks remained, visible only through technologies that can peel back the canopy's illusions. And with that fading came the strangest absence of all: memory. The world forgot millions of lives because the forest left no grand ruins to argue for their existence. It is a quiet kind of disappearance, one that makes the imagination linger. If so many lived here, why do we remember so few? And how different would our understanding of human history be if their presence had not been hidden beneath centuries of rain and roots? Yet, even without their voices, something of their world endures. The patterns they carved into the landscape reveal more than movement. They reveal intention, belief, and the stories they shaped their cities around. To understand the people, we must next explore the ideas that guided them, the cosmology woven into the very ground beneath the forest. When archaeologists traced the outlines captured by LiDAR, the forest floor revealed more than settlements. It revealed intention. Circles appeared with perfect symmetry, their diameters exact even across uneven ground. Rectangular plazas aligned neatly along cardinal directions. Long avenues stretched toward solstice points, as if guiding processions toward the rising or setting sun. Amid the wild, organic tangle of the rainforest, these shapes felt almost otherworldly expressions of a mind that saw harmony not in disorder, but in deliberate form. The contrast was striking. How could a society so deeply woven into the rhythms of the jungle produce designs that echoed the structured cities of distant empires? It suggested a worldview in which nature and geometry were not opposites but companions. Perhaps circles marked communal unity, or celestial cycles. Perhaps the straight lines mapped earthly pathways that mirrored heavenly ones. The forest today gives no clear answers, yet the patterns are too consistent to dismiss as coincidence. As researchers studied these layouts, theories began to unfold. Some saw astronomical observatories hidden beneath the leaves, grids of earth and clay aligned to track the movement of stars. Others suggested ritual centers meant to organize social life, each plaza reflecting a cosmology now lost to time. There were even whispers of political meaning designs that may have represented alliances, hierarchies, or mythic narratives etched into the land. Every possibility added another layer to the mystery, hinting at a symbolic language written in earth rather than stone. The emotional pull of these discoveries lingered. Geometry has a quiet power. It suggests purpose. And in a place long believed to be formless, purpose changes everything. It asks how the people here saw themselves within the vastness of the forest. It asks what stories they told in circles and squares, what meaning they found in aligning their homes with the sky. It asks whether these shapes were maps of belief as much as maps of cities. Yet the designs, as fascinating as they are, represent only part of a larger system. Geometry reveals intention, but it does not reveal the mechanisms that sustained these worlds. To understand how such societies flourished, we must look beyond patterns and symbols. We must follow the lines outward to the fields, the waterways, and the engineered landscapes that supported life beneath the canopy. Long before LiDAR traced the outlines of forgotten cities, another clue lay quietly beneath the surface. Something darker, richer, and completely out of place. In a region defined by thin, nutrient-poor soils that can exhaust themselves within a few seasons, patches of deep black earth appeared like quiet anomalies. Farmers noticed them first. Archaeologists followed. The soil felt different in the hand, heavier, more fragrant, almost alive in a way natural soil seldom is. It came to be known as terra preta, and its presence changed everything we thought we understood about the Amazon. Natural Amazonian soil is not meant to support dense populations. It leaches nutrients quickly, forcing vegetation to constantly compete for survival. Yet terra preta behaved in the opposite way. It held nutrients for centuries. It regenerated itself. Crops grew stronger and faster, as though guided by an unseen intelligence woven into the earth. Such fertility did not happen by accident. It was engineered. Its creation reveals a level of environmental mastery that still unsettles modern researchers. The people layered charcoal, broken pottery, fish bones, food waste, and plant matter in carefully controlled mixtures. They cultivated microorganisms that stabilized the soil, allowing it to renew rather than deplete. Fire, in small, precise doses, was used not to clear land, but to anchor carbon in the ground for generations. The result was a soil so resilient that even now, hundreds of years after the cities faded, it still nourishes crops. This discovery reshaped the narrative. The forest was not an untouched wilderness that resisted civilization. It was shaped, sculpted, and nurtured by the people who lived here. They understood the land well enough to remake it, designing soil systems that modern science has yet to replicate with the same elegance and longevity. Their mastery was not loud or monumental. It was quiet, buried, and astonishing. The emotional shift is subtle but profound. These were not people merely surviving in a hostile environment. They were reimagining it, creating a foundation strong enough to support millions. Terra Preta reveals intention and engineered world beneath the canopy. And this soil was only the beginning. To understand the full scale of their achievement, we must look at the broader systems it supported: the fields, orchards, and forest gardens that once flourished across this vast green domain. The deeper archaeologists looked beyond the traces of engineered soil, the more the forest itself began to appear designed. What seemed like untouched wilderness slowly rearranged itself into patterns of intention: fields raised above floodwaters, orchards planted in quiet sequences, and forests subtly shaped to yield food, medicine, fiber, and fuel. The Amazon, long imagined as an untamable expanse, was in many places a vast, cultivated mosaic. Each biome carried the fingerprints of people who once lived in harmony with its rhythms. Raised fields were among the first signs of this forgotten agricultural world. Built to rise above seasonal floods, they remained stable through cycles of rain and drought. When waterways overflowed, nutrient-rich sediments collected at their edges, renewing the land with every passing year. In the drier months, canals surrounding the fields provided irrigation and transportation, linking communities in ways that merged engineering with ecology. Just beyond these open spaces, the forest itself transformed. What appeared to be natural stands of fruit-bearing trees revealed carefully managed diversity clusters of species arranged so precisely that modern botanists now recognize them as ancient orchards. Brazil nuts, cacao, palms, and dozens of useful plants grew in patterns unlikely to occur by chance. These were not wild groves. They were curated gardens, shaped across generations by hands that understood how life could flourish when guided gently rather than forced. Engineered wetlands added yet another layer. Throughout floodplains, networks of ponds and channels created environments ideal for fish, turtles, and aquatic crops. These systems provided steady food supplies even in unpredictable seasons. They blurred the line between farming and ecosystem design, turning the landscape into a living infrastructure, flexible, resilient, and abundant. In this light, the cities of the Amazon were never separate from the forest. They were expressions of it. Homes, plazas, fields, and gardens flowed into one another without sharp boundaries. The architecture extended outward, shaped from living systems rather than carved from stone. The forest was not an obstacle to overcome, but a partner in creating communities that thrived quietly in its embrace. This realization widens the lens. Agriculture and settlement were only part of the story. To understand how such worlds endured, we must look next to the systems that bound them together. Networks of water, movement, and design that shaped life across the vast green landscape. Water in the Amazon behaves like a restless guest. It rises without warning, sinks without pattern, and reshapes the land with a quiet insistence that leaves no structure untouched. Yet the ancient inhabitants of this region learned not to resist it. Instead, they redirected its movements, guided its force, and transformed a landscape of unpredictable floods into a network of shimmering highways. What survives today beneath the forest floor are faint outlines of canals, ponds, and embankments, evidence of a hydrological mastery that once supported entire cities. The canals stretched in graceful arcs, linking settlements across vast distances. During the wet season, they carried boats easily between plazas and fields. In the dry months, they served as channels for irrigation, keeping crops alive even when the forest heat pressed heavily on the ground. Their shapes suggest not improvisation but design. Widths balanced for stability, depths calculated to endure shifting water levels, and alignments chosen to connect communities with remarkable efficiency. Alongside these waterways lay fish ponds, carefully sculpted basins where aquatic life could be harvested in predictable cycles. Some ponds were connected to seasonal streams that filled and emptied on cue, creating a rhythm of abundance that required only maintenance rather than constant rebuilding. Dikes and levees shaped the floodplains into living reservoirs, capturing water when the rivers swelled and releasing it slowly as the land dried. Together, these features created a landscape where food security was woven into the pulse of the environment. Imagining these waterways as they once were is like watching a forgotten film reel flicker back into motion. Boats gliding along narrow channels, carrying baskets of produce, children running along embankments hardened by countless footsteps, traders moving from village to village, guided by water that reflected the sky in thin, trembling ribbons. The forest canopy above would have shimmered with the movement of oars and voices. Yet today, almost nothing of that world remains visible. What heightens the mystery is how thoroughly time concealed these achievements. Water erodes, floods reshape, sediment buries, and yet traces endure just enough for modern eyes to recognize that these systems required coordination, planning, and a deep patience rarely acknowledged in discussions of Amazonian societies. With these waterways uncovered, the landscape becomes clearer. But another layer waits beneath the canopy, one not of movement, but of meaning. The next chapter opens onto the vast geometric earthworks that hint at a symbolic world as complex as the infrastructure itself. When LiDAR peeled back the canopy, it did more than reveal cities and fields. It exposed shapes so immense, so deliberate, that they seemed to belong to a different kind of map, one drawn not for daily life, but for meaning. Across the forest floor, in places where only trees and shadows had appeared for centuries, vast geometric earthworks emerged, circles carved with extraordinary precision, squares aligned with uncanny accuracy, octagons that seemed to echo the symmetry of distant civilizations. Long trenches ran like straight signatures across the landscape, uninterrupted by hills, rivers, or forest boundaries. Their purpose remains a quiet puzzle. Some archaeologists see ceremonial centers, places where ritual gatherings shape the social rhythm of communities. Others suggest astronomical alignments, noting how certain openings face the sunrise or sunset at key times of the year. A few imagine defensive structures, though the shapes feel too intentional, too elegant, to belong entirely to war. There are even theories that these earthworks served as narratives, stories written in earth, meant to be seen from vantage points now lost to time. The beauty of the mystery lies in the restraint of these interpretations. No single explanation satisfies every sight. Instead, the earthworks feel like a symbolic language whose grammar has eroded, leaving only the letters behind. Their scale suggests a worldview that extended beyond any individual settlement. Their repetition implies not coincidence, but communication, a shared understanding passed across vast distances. What unsettles scholars most is just how far these shapes stretch. They appear in the western Amazon, in the central basin, and all the way toward the eastern fringes of the forest. Thousands of kilometers apart, the same geometric vocabulary repeats itself. Circles, paired with squares, trenches intersecting at deliberate angles, and platforms positioned in patterns that defy randomness. It hints at a cultural unity woven across the rainforest, a network of ideas and beliefs as expansive as any empire, yet one that left no written records to explain itself. These earthworks whisper of a world whose coherence we are only beginning to perceive. They are the final layer of complexity uncovered in this chapter, the last reminder that the Amazon once held systems of thought as intricate as its ecosystems. And with this revelation comes a deeper question. If such order once flourished beneath the leaves, what force swept it away so completely that only the earth remembers the patterns? In most parts of the world, we discover ancient civilizations through what refuses to decay. Stone temples, fortified walls, carved monuments, enduring structures that resist rain, time, and human forgetfulness. Yet in the Amazon, permanence was never the measure of greatness. Here, societies flourished using materials that breathed with the forest. Wood shaped into towering homes, palm fiber woven into ceremonial roofs, earth molded into platforms that rose just above the floodplain. They built cities from the same substances that surrounded them, choosing resilience over rigidity, harmony over dominance. And because of that choice, almost everything vanished once the people were gone. Wood softens, fibers unravel, earth collapses back into soil. In this environment, decay is not an enemy, but a rule, a cycle that moves too quickly for monuments to survive. The structures that supported millions transformed into mulch and humus within decades. Where a plaza once echoed with footsteps, the ground became fertile enough for roots to weave through every trace. Where homes stood in dense, ordered clusters, vines crept in, reclaimed the beams, and erased the lines that once shaped neighborhoods. Scholars long mistook this absence for emptiness. They expected stone because stone endures. When they found none, they concluded that no great societies had ever existed here. But the forest does not preserve the past in obvious ways. It folds it inward. It spreads it thin. It transforms memory into patterns of soil, subtle changes in vegetation, faint platforms visible only when the light strikes the canopy just right. The Amazon did not lack civilization. It simply hid one built from materials meant to return to the earth. This contradiction carries a quiet emotional weight. Imagine a world full of markets, gatherings, celebrations, entire communities moving along, raised paths and waterways, now buried beneath centuries of green. The voices that once filled these spaces dissolved into birdsong and rustling leaves. The rhythms of daily life became indistinguishable from the forest's own breathing. What survives are whispers encoded in earthworks, in rich soils, and the geometry beneath the trees. Understanding this changes everything. A civilization can disappear not because it was fragile, but because it chose a different relationship with time. And now, another question rises from the silence. If these cities endured for centuries, what force brought their long story to such an abrupt and quiet end? Long before Europeans carved permanent settlements into the Amazon's edges, their presence was felt in ways no one could see. Illnesses carried across oceans, smallpox, measles, influenza, arrived quietly, riding the breath of traders, drifting from expedition camps, passing from one meeting to the next. The people of the forest had no defenses against these invisible intruders. Communities that had survived storms, droughts, and centuries of environmental change faced a threat their knowledge could not answer. The collapse began not with the sound of conflict, but with silence. The interconnectedness that once held the region together became its deepest vulnerability. Highways designed for trade carried more than goods. Canals that once ferried families and food now served as pathways for contagion. A single illness could move from one settlement to another in the span of days, carried along the very systems that had sustained life for generations. Populations that had flourished in the tens of thousands dwindled with devastating speed. Villages emptied, not through abandonment, but through loss so sudden that some communities vanished entirely before neighboring groups realized what had occurred. The scale of the collapse remains almost impossible to fathom. A thriving civilization unraveled quietly across millions of hectares, leaving behind no defenders, no chroniclers, no last voices to mark the moment. What remained in the wake of that devastation were hollow spaces, fields without farmers, plazas without gatherings, waterways without boats. The forest, patient as ever, sensed the absence and began its slow encroachment. Roots crept over pathways. Fallen leaves filled the places where stories had once been exchanged. Without the constant maintenance that kept the landscape open, the canopy thickened and closed like a curtain falling over a stage. Visitors who arrived decades later found only silence and trees. They saw no ruins, no monuments, no bustling markets. They assumed there had never been much to lose. Yet the emptiness they wandered through was not ancient. It was new. It was the afterimage of a catastrophe that spread too quickly to leave behind the usual scars of decline. And so the forest reclaimed what illness had emptied, layer upon layer, until the world forgot what once stood there. The next chapter explores this quiet reclamation, the final act of the jungle, as it buried evidence long before outsiders understood what they were seeing. Once the great populations of the Amazon fell silent, the forest began its slow, inevitable work. It did not rush. It did not rage. It simply continued growing in the way it always had, weaving itself through every place where human presence once held the ground open. Houses built from wood softened first, their beams bending under the weight of humidity until they collapsed inward like folded wings. Roofs of palm and fiber rotted into soil. Walls dissolved into mulch. Within a few seasons, the silhouettes of entire neighborhoods began to blur. Causeways that once carried traders and families filled with sediment carried on seasonal floods. Without constant clearing, vines crept across their surfaces, narrowing them until only faint rises remained. Canals shifted as roots thickened, and the water took unfamiliar routes, turning engineered waterways into tangled marshes. Agricultural fields, once carefully managed mosaics of raised beds and orchard clusters, reverted so completely that even their shapes disappeared beneath saplings and undergrowth. Floodplains that had been sculpted for centuries with quiet intelligence were among the first to vanish. Each rainy season brought new layers of silt, burying the last traces of human design beneath fresh earth. The systems that once controlled water now hid under shifting mud, as if the river itself wanted to smooth out what people had carved into its banks. By the time European travelers arrived again, decades after disease had emptied the region, nature's veil was complete. They saw only forest deep, seemingly primeval, unbroken in every direction. They did not imagine plazas beneath their feet or raised roads under the roots. They assumed that emptiness had always been the land's natural state. The silence comforted them. It confirmed what they expected to see. That misunderstanding hardened into academic certainty. For centuries, scholars repeated the same conclusion. The Amazon was too wild, too hostile, too poor to sustain complex societies. They mistook the forest's quiet reclamation for proof that nothing meaningful had ever been there. Yet silence is not the same as absence. Sometimes it is simply the echo of a story, carefully covered over, waiting for the moment when someone looks closely enough to see what hides beneath. And if the Amazon's history could be swallowed so completely, we must ask a larger question. Have forests elsewhere, hidden worlds, just as vast, just as forgotten, waiting for their own moment of rediscovery? The rediscovery of the Amazon's hidden cities does not stand alone. As researchers began lifting the canopy metaphorically and literally, they found echoes of this pattern across the world. In Southeast Asia, LiDAR revealed vast temple complexes and urban grids buried beneath Cambodian jungle for centuries, their outlines erased by vines and monsoon-fed soil. In Central Africa, remnants of interconnected towns surfaced in the savannas and forests of the Congo Basin, hinting at population densities far greater than previously imagined. Even in Oceania, on islands once thought sparsely inhabited, traces of terraced landscapes and engineered wetlands emerged when technology allowed eyes to see through vegetation. Each discovery whispered the same quiet message. Dense forests are not empty. They are archivists. They hide what stone cannot reveal. They soften edges, obscure roads, and return human labor to Earth with a tenderness that confuses later generations. The world's great archaeological narratives, Egyptian pyramids, Andean fortresses, Greek temples, endure because their materials refuse to yield. But civilizations that built with living matter, that shaped environments instead of conquering them, vanished more completely. Their stories dissolved into roots and soil, leaving only subtle signatures detectable centuries later. The Amazon, then, was never a strange anomaly. It was part of a global pattern we failed to recognize because we searched for history in stone alone. We overlooked societies that valued adaptation over grandeur, integration over permanence. These cultures flourished in landscapes that refused to preserve their achievements in obvious ways. Their absence misled us, not because they were small or fleeting, but because the environments they inhabited were too generous, too alive, too quick to reclaim what people left behind. As this realization unfolds, a deeper truth settles in. History is shaped not only by what humans create, but by what the land chooses to remember. Forests do not hold memories the way desert sands or mountain cliffs do. They rewrite them. They bury them. They protect them until the tools exist to uncover what was lost. Recognizing this places the Amazon within a broader awakening, a shift in how we understand the past. It invites us to look not for ruins, but for patterns, soils, alignments, clues that civilizations once thrived quietly beneath canopies we mistook for untouched wilderness. And with this wider frame in place, we now turn toward the people themselves, the cultures who shaped this forgotten world and carried its stories through daily life. Imagine waking each morning to a city that breathed with the forest rather than standing apart from it. Homes rose on sturdy wooden stilts, lifting families above the seasonal floods. Their walls were woven from palm fibers, their roofs layered with leaves that softened the sun and shed the rain in waves like quiet applause. These dwellings clustered along broad causeways, each path guiding people through a world shaped not by stone, but by rhythm. Water rising and falling, seasons shifting, the forest renewing itself with gentle inevitability. In the heart of the settlement, communal plazas opened into clearings, where trade and conversation mingled. Artisans carved tools from hardwood, shaped ceramics in shaded workshops, and wove baskets strong enough to carry fish caught from nearby ponds. Markets hummed, with goods gathered from distant regions, bright feathers, medicinal plants, smoked river fish, pigments made from earth and bark. Children ran between the stalls, pausing to watch elders repair nets or storytellers trace old tales into the dust. Gardens bordered many homes, cultivated with the same attention given to craft. Fruit trees grew in careful patterns, their branches forming living canopies above patches of cassava, peppers, and legumes. Beyond the gardens lay the fisheries' engineered ponds, where turtles, fish, and other aquatic life thrived in cycles guided by human hands. These food sources, woven into the city's design, gave stability to life even when the river behaved unpredictably. What the city lacked were walls. None rose to divide neighborhoods or separate people from the forest. The boundaries were alive, woven from roots, vines, and shared memory. Perhaps the landscape itself offered protection, or perhaps the people did not see themselves as separate enough to require barriers. Movement felt open, fluid, shaped by trust and long familiarity. Social life unfolded through cooperation. Families shared tasks during harvests and festivals. Ceremonial processions traveled the wide roads, their steps accompanied by songs that drifted between the trees. At night, lamps carved from gourds glowed softly on porches, casting warm light across pathways that curved into the darkness. Through these glimpses, the past becomes a place inhabited rather than abstract, a world shaped by hands and voices, not just patterns in the soil. And as daily life comes into focus, the deeper question rises. What beliefs guided these cities, and what stories shaped the way their people understood the forest around them? The cities hidden beneath the Amazon's canopy were shaped not only by practical needs, but by a cosmology woven into every path, plaza, and clearing. Though no written texts survive, the land still holds faint echoes of what the people believed. Circular plazas open to the rising sun suggest gatherings aligned with celestial moments. Rectangular courtyards face the directions of the winds. Long causeways tilt toward points on the horizon marked by solstices, as if guiding travelers through both space and story. Their worlds seemed to stretch upward as much as outward. The sky was not merely a backdrop, but a living map. Stars announced the seasons. The moon marked the river's moods. The sun guided the rhythms of planting and harvest. To walk through their cities was to move through a landscape that mirrored the heavens. Each alignment, a quiet reminder that life unfolded within a larger pattern. These alignments were not rigid doctrines, but gentle companions to daily life. Subtle cues that shaped gatherings, feasts, and rituals passed from one generation to the next. Beneath this celestial order lay another layer of meaning. Many communities honored the spirits of ancestors who dwelled symbolically below the earth. Offerings placed into the soil suggest a belief in the land as a bridge between the living and those who came before. Gardens near ceremonial spaces may have been tended as sacred groves, their arrangements echoing clan lineages or mythic stories. Ritual feasts likely took place in plazas illuminated by torchlight, where music pulsed through the night and the scent of roasted cassava drifted across the clearing. Nothing in these cities appears accidental. The geometry reveals both the rational and the spiritual. Circles may have signified unity or cycles of return. Squares may have represented order, community, or the structure of daily life. The interplay between these shapes creates a dialogue between earth and sky, between the predictable and the mysterious. It is a worldview expressed not through monuments, but through orientation, movement, and memory. Yet the absence of written explanation leaves every interpretation touched by uncertainty. What remains is an atmosphere, a feeling, a sense that their rituals were less about commanding nature and more about participating in it. And from this shared cosmology rises another question. How far did these beliefs travel, and what links connected distant communities across the green world? Across the vastness of the Amazon, where rivers twist like liquid pathways and the forest stretches without boundary, Movement was never as limited as outsiders once imagined. Evidence buried beneath centuries of soil reveals a world knitted together by trade, long-distance connections that defy the idea of isolated settlements. Shells from distant coasts appear hundreds of kilometers inland, polished smooth by hands far removed from ocean spray. Stones from remote highlands show up in lowland workshops, shaped into tools and ornaments. Ceramics uncovered in far-flung regions share motifs so similar they seem to echo a shared artistic language whispered across the forest. These exchanges were not random. They moved along arteries, formed by the great river systems, where boats glided silently beneath overhanging branches. Traders carried goods, but also stories, rituals, songs, techniques for farming or crafting, beliefs that shifted subtly as they traveled from one community to another. Along raised causeways, footpaths, and waterways engineered to endure the seasons, people crossed distances that today seem almost unimaginable. Their world may have lacked metal roads or written treaties, yet their networks pulsed with life. Each connection hints at a society far more interwoven than scholars once assumed. The Amazon was not a scattering of isolated groups surviving independently in pockets of forest. It was a tapestry, each settlement a thread tied to many others. Trade goods reveal alliances. Shared symbols point to cultural unity. Even the shapes of earthworks across the region suggest a diffusion of ideas, a common language expressed through geometry and ritual. The imagery of this movement is quiet but powerful. Imagine boats drifting along mirrored water, carrying baskets of fruit, pigments made from crushed minerals, beads crafted from seeds and shell. Imagine travelers arriving at distant plazas, greeted not as strangers, but as participants in a wider world. Ideas flowed as gently as the current, shaping societies without the force of empire or conquest. This interconnectedness makes the Amazon feel less like an isolated wilderness, and more like a vast, breathing cultural landscape. Yet even with these networks, the people here made choices about development that diverged from other global civilizations. Their achievements had limits, but those limits revealed just as much as their successes. Now we turn to the boundaries of their ambitions, and consider why they never sought to build an empire, in a world where connection was already so strong. In many parts of the world, complexity is measured by scale. The rise of empires, the sweep of armies, the construction of monuments meant to outlast centuries. Yet in the Amazon, no single kingdom gathered all others beneath its banner. No central capital commanded obedience across thousands of kilometers. Instead, the forest was home to a constellation of interconnected settlements, each vibrant in its own way, each bound to others through trade, ritual, and shared ideas rather than conquest. The reasons lie partly in the land itself. The rainforest offered abundance in every direction. Fruit, game, fish, fertile pockets of engineered soil, and waterways capable of supporting entire communities. There was little to gain from subjugating distant groups when nature already provided what people needed. The challenge was not controlling resources, but adapting to a world where rivers shifted without warning, and seasons could erase pathways overnight. Decentralization made societies more resilient. If one region faced hardship, others could continue unharmed, connected but never dependent. Leadership here appears to have been fluid, shaped by influence rather than authority. Some settlements grew large and powerful, others remained smaller but no less important. Alliances formed through marriage, trade, and shared rituals. But these bonds did not harden into rigid hierarchies. Power flowed like water, moving, adjusting, taking the shape of the moment. It was a model of complexity built on cooperation rather than domination. This does not mean the Amazon lacked sophistication. The engineered soils, geometric earthworks, and large population networks, revealed by modern technology, point to societies fully capable of planning, innovation, and long-term coordination. But they invested their ingenuity inward, toward understanding the forest, managing water cycles, cultivating biodiversity, rather than outward into expansion or warfare. The forest rewarded those who listened, and discouraged those who tried to impose permanence on a landscape shaped by constant motion. The absence of an empire, then, was not a sign of limitation. It was a choice, a structure evolved for balance, not control, for adaptation, not uniformity. Their world did not need an emperor to function. It needed communities skilled at reading the land and sustaining it. And now, after centuries of silence, we turn to the moment when this forgotten world began to reappear, when modern eyes and new technologies finally uncovered the scale of what had been hidden beneath the leaves. Long before lasers traced the contours of forgotten cities, a handful of researchers noticed details that refused to fit the accepted story. An explorer trekking through a clearing would pause over a mound that rose too evenly from the earth. A farmer digging a ditch would strike shards of pottery thicker and more finely crafted than anything known from local traditions. Soil scientists, puzzled by patches of deep black earth, wondered how such fertility could appear in a landscape famous for rapid nutrient loss. These fragments of evidence surfaced again and again, scattered like puzzle pieces dropped across the forest floor. Yet each clue was treated as an exception, a curiosity rather than a revelation. The belief that the Amazon was a pristine wilderness was so deeply rooted that any anomaly was absorbed into that narrative. Mounds were attributed to natural formations. Fertile soils were explained away as isolated quirks. Earthworks glimpsed from plains during deforestation were dismissed as remnants of modern activity. The possibility that these features belonged to ancient, organized societies simply did not align with what scholars expected to find. The frustration in hindsight is quiet but unmistakable. The truth was not hidden behind impenetrable walls. It was scattered in plain sight, waiting for someone to connect the dots. Aerial photographs taken in the mid-20th century revealed geometric shapes carved into the ground, but without context, they became footnotes. Archaeologists documented pottery far older and more intricate than anticipated, yet their findings struggled against academic certainty. Each discovery flickered briefly, then dimmed beneath the weight of assumptions. Still, the forest kept offering clues. A trench too straight, a plaza too level, a terrace too broad. The pieces accumulated, whispering that the landscape had been shaped with intention long before modern observers arrived. Those whispers grew faint but persistent, eventually forming the foundation for a shift that would only come decades later. These early signs were the first cracks in the story of an untouched Amazon, a reminder that understanding falters when expectation outweighs observation. Once technology finally aligned with curiosity, the puzzle would begin to assemble itself. And so we moved toward the moment when light scattered through the canopy revealed everything that had been waiting beneath it. When LiDAR was first carried over the Amazon, no one expected it to transform the understanding of an entire continent's past. It was a tool designed for mapping forests, planning infrastructure, and assisting aircraft navigation. Yet its ability to send pulses of light through dense vegetation and return with a precise image of the ground became the key to a world buried beneath centuries of green. The forest canopy, once an opaque curtain, suddenly dissolved into a thin veil. Beneath it, outlines emerged like bones returning to memory. Scientists described the first moments of LiDAR analysis with a kind of hushed astonishment. A screen that once showed nothing but uniform green suddenly displayed straight lines cutting through the terrain. Then came circles, rectangles, grids, the unmistakable signatures of plazas, platforms, canals, and roads. Places long assumed empty became dense with structure. Entire settlement clusters appeared where the forest had seemed untouched. The land began to speak. One discovery led to another with disorienting speed. A cluster of geometric shapes revealed a ceremonial complex larger than any known village in the region. A series of parallel lines turned out to be ancient highways stretching for kilometers. Earthworks emerged in patterns so vast they could only be appreciated from the sky. What explorers had missed on foot, technology revealed in minutes, cities hidden not by distance, but by leaves. The surreal beauty of these images carried an emotional weight. They were not ruins uncovered by excavation. They were ghosts illuminated by light, returning to visibility for the first time in centuries. Every new scan expanded the map of human presence, suggesting not isolated settlements, but systems networks planned with purpose, sustained through cooperation, and aligned with natural rhythms. The revelation shook the foundations of archaeology. A tool built for modern engineering had pierced through both foliage and assumption, showing that the Amazon had never been an uninhabited wilderness. It had been shaped, cultivated, and engineered on a scale no one imagined. The past did not need to be found. It only needed to be seen. And with these shapes now visible to all, a deeper shift began, one that challenged long-standing beliefs and forced scholars to reconsider everything they thought they knew about the rainforest and the people who once called it home. For generations, The academic world spoke with steady confidence about the Amazon's past. The rainforest, they said, could not support large populations. Its soils were too poor, its floods too unpredictable, its distances too vast. The earliest explorers who claimed to have seen great settlements were dismissed as unreliable dreamers or desperate men embellishing their failures. The assumption became doctrine. The Amazon had always been sparsely inhabited. Complexity was impossible here. Then LiDAR exposed lines and shapes that contradicted every certainty. At first, disbelief softened the shock. Some argued the scans were misinterpreted. Others suggested natural formations or modern disturbances. But as more images arrived showing plazas in perfect alignment, causeways stretching across floodplains, and earthworks repeating patterns over vast distances, doubt began to crumble. The evidence grew too large, too consistent, too precise to ignore. Debate followed. Scholars confronted a reality that demanded new explanations. Old assumptions unraveled under the weight of geometry carved into the land. Theories that once seemed unshakable now appeared narrow, shaped more by limited tools than by truth. Slowly, acceptance emerged, not as surrender, but as recognition that the past had been speaking all along and no one had been able to hear clearly. Intellectual humility became essential. Experts accustomed to studying ruins built from stone had to adjust their vision to societies that chose materials destined to return to the earth. They realized that absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, especially in places where nature excels at erasing human footprints. What had been called wilderness was in many regions an engineered landscape, its soils enriched, its waterways shaped, its forests curated by centuries of intentional care. As the paradigm shifted, the Amazon transformed from a marginal space in global history into a central question. How many other assumptions rested on foundations as fragile as the ones just overturned? The rainforest was no longer an untouched world, but a palimpsest, a place where old stories hid beneath the canopy, waiting for the right moment to surface. This moment of collective recognition marked the beginning of a broader awakening. With the old narrative dismantled, researchers from around the world began to collaborate, sensing that understanding the Amazon required new methods and new voices. And so the story widens, moving toward the global network of scientists, indigenous communities, and explorers, now working together to uncover what the forest has guarded for centuries. As the old paradigm dissolved, a new kind of exploration quietly took its place. No longer defined by lone adventurers hacking through vines or scholars relying on distant assumptions, the rediscovery of the Amazon began to emerge from collaboration, patient, deliberate, and deeply human. Archaeologists walked alongside indigenous researchers whose ancestors had lived in these landscapes for generations. Drone pilots swept the canopy with cameras and sensors, revealing patterns impossible to see from the ground. Environmental scientists mapped soils and waterways, tracing the ecological fingerprints of ancient engineering. Community leaders guided teams through regions where stories lingered in place names and seasonal rituals. This partnership signaled a shift from extraction to understanding. For centuries, indigenous knowledge had been dismissed as myth or metaphor. Now, it shaped the very questions researchers asked. Guidance from elders revealed where certain plants grew in unnatural clusters, hinting at former orchards. Oral histories pointed toward mounds long hidden under vegetation. Subtle details so easily overlooked by outsiders became vital keys to interpreting what LiDAR had revealed. The atmosphere around this work felt like a quiet renaissance. Instead of a single discovery solving a mystery, countless small insights began fitting together, reconstructing a world that had once dissolved beneath the weight of time. Each participant brought a different lens, and together they formed a picture far richer than any individual could have uncovered. The forest was no longer an obstacle to conquer, but a partner in revealing its own buried memories. What emerged from these collaborations was more than data. It was a sense of shared purpose, a recognition that understanding the past required humility and cooperation. Young researchers, trained in cutting-edge technology, learned to read the forest through indigenous ways of seeing. Elders watched as the knowledge their communities had preserved for centuries gained broader recognition. Drone maps blended with ancestral stories, modern science with ancient familiarity. Rediscovery, once accidental and fragmented, became intentional. Each new scan, each excavation, each carefully shared piece of knowledge contributed to a growing awareness of how complex, connected, and vibrant the Amazon once was. Now, With people finally listening to voices long ignored and tools revealing patterns long hidden, the story shifts again toward the deeper meaning behind these revelations and what they ask us to reconsider about humanity's place in the world. For centuries, travelers described the Amazon as a vast, untouched wilderness, a cathedral of trees so dense and ancient that it seemed older than memory itself. To early explorers, the forest appeared primeval, unmarred by human influence, a place where nature alone ruled. This image settled into global consciousness with remarkable ease. It felt reassuring, even poetic, a perfect landscape preserved beyond the reach of civilization. Yet the truth, now emerging from soil, scans, and scattered clues, tells a very different story. Much of what appeared natural was, in fact, the afterimage of human hands. Orchards mistaken for wild groves grew in carefully curated patterns. Forest clearings aligned with old plazas had regrown so completely that only the subtlest shifts in vegetation betrayed their origins. Plants favored by ancient communities still cluster in regions once densely inhabited. Even the diversity of the rainforest, long celebrated as untouched wonder, was shaped in part by centuries of tending, harvesting, and selective cultivation. The wilderness that explorers admired was often abandoned farmland, quietly reclaiming its layers. Colonial narratives contributed to the misunderstanding. Early Europeans arrived after disease had swept through the region, encountering land emptied of its people but full of their lingering influence. Without knowledge of what had been lost, observers assumed nothing significant had ever existed. Written accounts emphasized emptiness, because emptiness was all the writers saw. And when those accounts became the foundation of scholarship, they reinforced a vision of the Amazon as timeless and pristine, even though many landscapes were palimpsests of human activity. The forest itself deepened the illusion. Its ability to reclaim abandoned settlements with startling speed meant that only decades separated thriving communities from apparent wilderness. Roots erased homes, vines covered causeways, soils enriched by ancient farming blended into the forest floor. What survived were hints so subtle that, for generations, no one recognized them for what they were. The revelation that the untouched Amazon is, in many regions, a memory made visible only through patterns and persistence unsettles our assumptions. It asks us to reconsider the line between nature and culture, to see the forest not as isolated from humanity, but as shaped by lives that have long since faded. And this shift in perspective leads directly to another question. How has this misunderstanding influenced the way we think about conservation and the modern environment? For generations, scientists walked through the Amazon, believing they were moving through untouched wilderness. The forest felt ancient, self-created, shaped only by wind, rain, and roots. But as botanists began cataloguing species with greater precision, they noticed patterns too intentional to ignore. Useful trees appeared in clusters that mirrored agricultural design rather than natural growth. Certain fruit-bearing species grew in densities that defied ecological randomness. Soil enriched far beyond natural levels appeared beneath groves that had no obvious connection to rivers or floodplains. The forest, long assumed to be spontaneous, revealed the quiet geometry of human hands. These discoveries illuminated a truth hiding in plain sight. Ancient Amazonian people had not battled the jungle, they had collaborated with it. They encouraged particular species, shaped gardens that blended into the forest canopy, and cultivated diversity that mimicked nature so perfectly that later generations mistook their work for wilderness. What seemed wild was, in many areas, a living heritage of choices made centuries before choices, woven so deeply into the ecosystem that the boundary between design and growth became impossible to distinguish. The emotional impact of this realization lingers gently. It suggests a kind of humility, that the forest remembered what humanity forgot. Long after cities fell silent, the species people nurtured continued to thrive. Their gardens persisted as echoes, not because anyone maintained them, but because the landscape had absorbed their patterns. The Amazon did not erase its past. It incorporated it, transforming human intention into ecological continuity. Such revelations invite a broader question. If the Amazon holds these hidden fingerprints, how many other environments around the world carry similar traces, shaped, subtly, invisibly, by societies whose stories faded? Landscapes we call natural may be palimpsests, layered with forgotten interactions between people and place. The idea enlarges our sense of the world, reminding us that absence of memory is not absence of history. Nature, it seems, can preserve human presence in forms we do not expect, not as ruins or inscriptions, but as living patterns, orchards disguised as forests, diversity curated by ancient knowledge, soils enriched with care and intention. And as this realization deepens, another dimension of rediscovery emerges: the cultural implications. What does it mean for identity, ancestry, and belonging when entire civilizations reappear from beneath the leaves, asking to be remembered once more? For generations, indigenous communities across the Amazon carried stories of great settlements, sacred plazas, ancestral migrations, and wide roads that once connected distant peoples. These tales were shared in riverbank gatherings, sung during festivals, woven into myths that blended daily life with cosmic understanding. Outsiders heard these stories and often dismissed them as symbolic, too elaborate to reflect historical reality. Without ruins of stone or written records, the possibility of ancient cities seemed to scholars like wishful memory rather than truth. But now, LiDAR maps echo those voices. The lines traced through the canopy match the roads described in oral histories. The circular plazas, long spoken of in ritual stories, emerge clearly in satellite scans. Patterns once thought metaphorical reveal themselves as geographic fact. What was once relegated to legend now stands revealed as memory preserved in another medium, one passed through generations not in stone, but in story. The emotional weight of this validation is profound. Archaeological rediscovery is not merely an academic correction. It is an act of restoration. It acknowledges that the descendants of this world were never without history, never without roots anchored deep in the forest. For many indigenous communities, seeing their ancestors' cities appear on modern maps is less a revelation and more a homecoming. It confirms what they always knew, that their people shaped the land, tended it, and thrived long before outside eyes arrived. The narration moves gently through this realization, honoring the resilience of memory that endured, even when the physical world disappeared beneath vines and soil. It highlights a dignity long denied, a recognition that these cultures were not primitive, but deeply knowledgeable, adaptive, and sophisticated. The forest that outsiders assumed was untouched carries the fingerprints of their ancestors, preserved in patterns too large to see without the right tools. As stories and scans converge, a fuller picture emerges, one where science and tradition complement one another, each filling the gaps left by the other. This renewed understanding strengthens cultural identity, weaving ancient memory back into the present. And with this reconnection comes a broader question, one that pulls the documentary toward its philosophical heart. If such vast chapters of humanity's story remained hidden here, how many more blind spots shape our understanding of the past and our place within it? The rediscovery of the Amazon's ancient cities invites a quieter, deeper question, one that lingers long after the evidence is laid out. If an entire world of plazas, roads, gardens, and beliefs could disappear so completely that scholars insisted it had never existed, then how much of human history rests beyond the reach of our current understanding? The rainforest covered its stories with leaves and roots, but other landscapes hold secrets of their own. Oceans rise and swallow coastlines. Deserts shift and bury settlements beneath dunes. Mountains slide. Rivers change course. Entire ecologies transform. What seems permanent in one era becomes invisible in another. Archaeology, for all its precision, works with fragments, shards, soils, patterns, and the rare structures left behind by chance. Written history, revered for its clarity, reflects only the voices that held power or survived catastrophe. Most people who ever lived left no documents, no monuments, no carved inscriptions to anchor their memory. Their stories endured through hands, gardens, tools, songs, and choices that shaped landscapes more subtly than stone. When those landscapes changed, the stories softened and dispersed. The Amazon is not an exception. It is a reminder. The narration drifts into a reflective calm here, inviting viewers into the quiet space between known facts and possible worlds. Imagine what lies beneath the flooded deltas of ancient rivers, or under layers of volcanic ash, or within caves still sealed by time. Consider the societies that built with wood, reed, clay, or fiber materials that served them perfectly, but left little trace for modern eyes. History is often told through what survives longest, not through what shaped the most lives. The difference is enormous. The Amazon's rediscovery suggests that our view of the past is a narrow beam in a vast darkness. We piece together civilizations because a few clues endured, but countless others may have risen, flourished, and faded with so little physical residue that their absence becomes invisible. This is not a cause for despair, but an invitation to wonder. The puzzle of humanity is not complete. It has barely begun. Most of its pieces still rest buried, waiting for tools, insights, or perspectives not yet imagined. And this realization guides the story forward. If history can vanish so easily, then the lessons within these forgotten worlds carry greater weight. They are not only archaeological revelations, but ecological and scientific messages, signals about how humans once lived within landscapes rather than against them. Long before the word sustainability existed, the people of the ancient Amazon had already crafted a system that embodied it. Their world was not built on the premise of conquering nature, but on the understanding that survival depended on partnership. Instead of clearing vast territories or exhausting soils, they shaped ecosystems that grew stronger with each generation. What modern societies treat as cutting-edge environmental insight was, for them, ordinary life woven into every field, garden, and waterway. Terra Preta stands as the clearest example. This dark, regenerative soil did more than nourish crops. It improved with time, absorbing carbon, fostering resilient microbial communities, and renewing itself long after the hands that shaped it were gone. Floodplains, instead of being feared, were embraced. By sculpting channels, mounds, and seasonal basins, ancient Amazonians transformed unpredictable waters into dependable nurseries for fish, turtles, and aquatic plants. Their landscapes acted not as farms alone, but as living, adaptable systems that supported both human needs and ecological diversity. Forests, too, bore the imprint of intentional design. Many of the regions now celebrated for their extraordinary biodiversity were, in part, curated environments, gardens shaped across centuries. Fruit trees, medicinal plants, and useful palms grew in patterns that mirrored human preference rather than natural chance. These arboreal mosaics sustained communities through droughts, storms, and shifting climates, proving their resilience in ways modern agriculture often fails to match. What emerges from this rediscovery is a worldview distinct from the modern narrative of extraction. The ancient Amazonian model did not drain resources faster than they could recover. It expanded abundance by working with the grain of the environment. Their engineering rested on patience, observation, and the knowledge that landscapes thrive when treated as partners, not obstacles. It is a quiet but profound lesson. Complexity and sustainability are not opposites, they can rise together. For late-night listeners, this realization settles like a soft awakening. A forgotten civilization may offer insights urgently needed today. Their systems endured for centuries, not because they were simple, but because they were wise. They reveal that the path to resilience often lies in humility, in listening to the land rather than forcing it to conform. And with this foundation laid, the story turns toward an even deeper layer of their ingenuity. How their food systems challenge everything we think we know about pre-modern agriculture. Feeding dense populations without stripping the land is a challenge that modern societies have yet to master. But in the ancient Amazon, people solved it with a quiet genius that feels almost radical today. Instead of clearing vast swaths of forest, they created systems that intensified productivity while deepening ecological resilience. Their world was abundant, not because they conquered nature, but because they allowed it to flourish alongside them. Raised fields were one of their signature innovations. Built above flood level, these platforms harnessed the rhythm of seasonal waters. During floods, nutrient-rich sediments settled around them, renewing the soil naturally. As waters receded, canals formed beside the fields, holding fish, turtles, and aquatic plants that supplemented human diets. A single landscape served multiple functions: farming, fishing, water storage, ensuring year-round sustenance without exhausting the earth. Managed wetlands extended this philosophy. Instead of draining or avoiding marshy areas, ancient Amazonians shaped them into intricate mosaics of ponds and ridges. These wetlands acted as vast food-producing engines, turning unpredictable hydrology into a dependable source of protein and plant crops. They were engineered ecosystems, flexible enough to shift with the seasons yet structured enough to sustain large communities. Beyond the open fields and waterways, forest gardens formed a quieter layer of abundance. These semi-wild orchards were curated over generations, blending cultivated species with naturally occurring plants. Fruit trees, medicinal shrubs, nuts, fibers, and spices thrived together in patterns too deliberate to be accidental. Such gardens produced food throughout the year, buffering communities against droughts and climate fluctuations. They represented an understanding that diversity is strength, an idea modern agriculture often overlooks. The result was a food system capable of supporting millions across the region, all without triggering the ecological collapse commonly associated with large populations. Their fields were regenerative, their wetlands were dynamic, and their gardens were living archives of knowledge. In this world, production and preservation were not opposing forces but partners in daily life. For the viewer, this realization offers a soothing yet powerful image. Abundance need not require destruction. The forest lived, and so did the people, each shaping the other in ways that created a long-lasting equilibrium. With these foundations of sustenance understood, the story turns now to the built environment itself, to the architecture and engineering that allowed cities to adapt gracefully to the forest's shifting conditions. In the Amazon, architecture evolved not through the pursuit of permanence, but through a deep understanding of change. Cities here were shaped by a landscape that rose and fell with the seasons, where rivers wandered, rains arrived suddenly, and the earth itself shifted underfoot. Rather than resisting these rhythms, ancient builders embraced them. Their homes stood on elevated stilts, lifting families above floodwaters that swept through the forest each year. These structures did not defy the environment, they anticipated it, absorbing its cycles with a quiet grace. Movement between neighborhoods followed the same philosophy. Causeways stretched across low-lying areas, rising just enough to remain passable when rains transformed paths into streams. During the dry season, these elevated roads became thoroughfares. During floods, they became bridges above the swelling water. Cities expanded and contracted with the weather, their boundaries defined not by walls but by the shifting contours of water and land. Even public spaces, plazas, gathering grounds, ceremonial areas were designed with flexible edges, allowing them to serve multiple purposes across the year's unfolding pattern. Materials, too, reflected an intimate relationship with the forest. Builders chose wood, palm fiber, clay, and woven plant matter, not because they lacked alternatives, but because these materials breathed, cooled, and decayed in harmony with the environment. Structures were airy, ventilated by natural breezes, illuminated softly by filtered light. When buildings aged, they returned to the soil, leaving space for renewal rather than ruin. The result was a cityscape that left minimal scars, a design philosophy rooted in impermanence, where beauty lay not in endurance, but in adaptability. This approach invites a shift in perspective. Strength, in this world, was not measured by how long a structure stood unchanged, but by how seamlessly it responded to its surroundings. A house built to biodegrade was not a sign of fragility. It was a gesture of trust in a landscape meant to evolve. A causeway that blended into the earth after centuries was not a failure of engineering. It was a marker of a civilization that understood the forest as a living partner, not an adversary. Through this lens, Amazonian cities become more than archaeological puzzles. They become expressions of a worldview grounded in harmony, patience, and renewal. And with this understanding of how they built and lived, the documentary now turns to the lessons their choices offer today, insights into resilience, humility, and the human place within the natural world. The rediscovered Amazonian world does more than correct the historical record. It offers a quiet mirror for the present. In their choices, what they built, how they lived, what they valued, these ancient communities reveal a model of resilience profoundly different from modern expectations. Their cities did not rise through centralized authority or rigid hierarchy. Instead, strength came from networks, flexible alliances, shared knowledge, and systems designed to endure through cooperation rather than control. In a world where landscapes shift without warning, adaptability became a form of wisdom. Their agricultural practices embody the same philosophy. Instead of exhausting the soil, they enriched it. Instead of clearing forests, they transformed them into living orchards. Water was not fenced off or forced into submission. It was guided gently, shaped into ponds, canals, and wetlands that supported both people and the ecosystem. Every layer of their engineering carried a reciprocal intention: take only what can be replenished, and invest in what will outlast you. The result was abundance that endured for centuries without collapse, a balanced partnership between human needs and environmental rhythms. The emotional resonance of their worldview lies in its humility. These societies did not imagine themselves as separate from the forest. They saw themselves as participants in its unfolding. They embraced impermanence, allowing buildings to return to earth and fields to shift with the seasons. They placed value not in monuments, but in continuity of soil, of water, of community. Their resilience came not from resisting change, but from absorbing it as part of life. For modern audiences, listening late at night, this realization arrives softly but powerfully. In a world grappling with climate instability, resource depletion, and the fragility of complex systems, the Amazonian model offers more than historical curiosity. It presents an alternative blueprint, one rooted in reciprocity, patience, and the understanding that long-term survival depends on more than innovation. It depends on alignment with the living world. Their forgotten choices feel unexpectedly contemporary. Decentralized networks resemble resilient communities. Regenerative soils echo current environmental science. Forest gardens anticipate sustainable agriculture. And their acceptance of change challenges modern desires for permanence. These lessons, once buried beneath layers of leaves and assumptions, now rise again as guideposts. They remind us that the past does not simply rest behind us, it can illuminate the path forward. And with this reflection, the story shifts toward the deeper mysteries that remain. The unanswered questions still hidden beneath the forest canopy. Despite all the revelations of recent years, the Amazon remains one of the least mapped regions on Earth. LiDAR surveys, though transformative, have only skimmed the surface, thin lines of scanned corridors drifting across a rainforest the size of a continent. Tens of thousands of square kilometers remain untouched by this technology. In those uncharted expanses, untouched by modern light beams, the forest keeps its secrets close. What we now recognize as ancient cities might represent only the opening scenes of a far larger story. Scientists studying the patterns from completed LiDAR missions notice something tantalizing. Settlements often appear in clusters. A single discovery is rarely isolated. It hints at a network. For every city revealed, statistical models suggest there may be dozens more hidden in surrounding regions. And when roads appear straight, elevated, unmistakably engineered, they often lead beyond the edges of current maps, vanishing into areas yet to be scanned. Each unexplored swath becomes a place where imagination meets probability. Beneath these untouched canopies may lie entire landscapes shaped by human hands, ceremonial complexes aligned to stars, agricultural systems sculpted into rhythmic patterns, and dense populations whose daily footsteps once echoed along causeways now silent. The magnitude of what remains hidden is difficult to grasp. Some researchers quietly speculate that the largest Amazonian settlement has not yet been rediscovered, that somewhere beneath layers of vegetation a metropolis awaits, larger and more intricate than any revealed so far. The narration lingers here, inviting viewers into this quiet anticipation. What does it mean to stand at the threshold of a past only beginning to reveal itself? Each new scan holds the possibility of shifting history again, of altering how we understand civilization, landscape, and human ingenuity. The forest that once erased these cities now shelters them, preserving memories in root and soil until technology arrives to uncover them gently. This sense of a sleeping world, vast, intricate, and still largely unseen, gives the Amazon a dreamlike presence. What we know feels fragile beside what we have yet to discover. The map is expanding, but slowly, with the patience the forest demands. And from this mystery of scale, the story turns toward mysteries of meaning. Questions not about how much remains hidden, but about why these ancient people built their worlds in the ways they did. Scattered beneath the Amazon's canopy lie shapes so deliberate, so mathematically precise, that they feel like messages carved into the earth itself. Perfect circles etched with unbroken symmetry, squares aligned so carefully that their corners point toward cardinal directions. Intersecting geometries forming patterns too large to perceive from the ground, designs that reveal their full meaning only when seen from above, as though made for eyes that could fly. These earthworks linger as the most enigmatic traces of the civilizations that once flourished here. Researchers approach them cautiously, balancing theory with humility. Some believe these vast forms served as astronomical observatories, anchoring ceremonies to the turning of seasons and the movement of stars. Others see them as ritual centers, places where communities gathered to renew their connection with the cosmos. Still, others propose that the shapes reflected social structure, each plaza a marker of identity, memory, or clan lineage. But none of these explanations satisfy fully. The symbols remain too varied, too widespread, and too consistent across distant regions to be reduced to a single purpose. What deepens the mystery is repetition. Identical geometric structures appear thousands of kilometers apart, carved by groups separated by rivers, forests, and time. Circles paired with squares, trenches intersecting at precise angles, elongated rectangles opening toward sunrise or sunset. Patterns echo one another across astonishing distances. Such consistency implies a shared cultural code, a symbolic language understood widely but now silent. It suggests a worldview in which meaning was inscribed, not in writing, but in the land itself. Walking through these spaces today offers few answers. On the ground, the monumental designs dissolve into gentle slopes and shallow trenches, softened by centuries of rain and roots. Only from above does their full intention emerge vast, elegant expressions of thought and belief. And yet, the very scale that makes them awe-inspiring also keeps their purpose elusive. They speak clearly, but in a language time has blurred. The narration lingers in this ambiguity, inviting viewers into a quiet space where curiosity outweighs certainty. These symbols remind us that understanding the past is not about solving every mystery, but about recognizing which mysteries deserve to endure. And from this realm of meaning still concealed, we turn toward the deeper question that shadows the entire story. Not only what vanished under the forest, but why it disappeared so completely and so suddenly. The end of the ancient Amazonian world did not arrive with the thunder of armies or the crack of burning cities. It unfolded in ways so quiet, so complex, that even now the details remain veiled beneath layers of time. Across different regions, the decline came at different speeds. Some settlements emptied rapidly, as if struck by an unseen force. Others faded gradually, leaving behind only faint traces of continued life. The reasons remain elusive, shaped by circumstances we can observe only through scattered clues. Disease brought by early contact almost certainly played a devastating role, sweeping through interconnected populations faster than messages could travel. But this alone cannot fully explain the uneven patterns of collapse. In some areas, earthworks continued to be maintained long after neighboring regions had fallen silent. Elsewhere, agricultural systems show signs of stress, flood cycles growing unpredictable, soils shifting in ways that may hint at climatic change. Perhaps subtle variations in environment nudged communities toward relocation. Perhaps social ties weakened when numbers dwindled. Perhaps leadership structures, once fluid and cooperative, struggled to adapt when disease fractured networks. The narration avoids the temptation to force a single answer. Ecological civilizations rarely collapse in straight lines. Their endings resemble fading constellations. One light dims, then another, each shaped by its own conditions, yet all contributing to a larger transformation. What remains certain is that the people who once shaped the forest did not vanish in a moment. Their world receded step by step, absorbed by the landscape they had tended for centuries. As populations fell and maintenance waned, the forest advanced with quiet certainty. Floodplains reclaimed canals, roots penetrated homes, gardens dissolved into undergrowth. Without the daily presence of human hands, the cities that had once pulsed with life softened into impressions in the soil. Their stories became earth, their structures memory, their presence a pattern detectable only through the subtle clues of a landscape learning to speak again. The emotional resonance lies in this gentleness. Civilizations do not always end in fire. Sometimes they drift into the background until the world forgets they were ever there. Their silence lingers not as tragedy, but as mystery, asking us to listen more closely to what remains. And from this quiet vanishing, the narrative turns forward, toward the modern responsibility to protect what has been rediscovered, and what still waits beneath the forest for its moment to return. For centuries, the Amazon protected its buried cities with layers of leaves, roots, and silence. The same forces that once sheltered ancient worlds now face pressures they were never meant to withstand. Deforestation peels back the canopy faster than archaeologists can map what lies beneath. River dredging reshapes waterways that once carried stories across great distances. Mining cuts into the earth, scattering the fragile patterns that held clues to forgotten lives. Agricultural expansion clears areas where geometric earthworks may rest just below the surface, erasing them before light ever reaches them. The irony is quiet, but devastating. What the forest preserved through time, modern industry may destroy in decades. LiDAR, which revealed so much, now captures glimpses of sites moments before they disappear. A grid of squares glowing faintly on a screen may already be gone by the time a team arrives on foot. The urgency is not loud or dramatic, it is slow, steady, and deeply human. Rediscovery brings responsibility, and responsibility requires action before silence claims these places again. Archaeologists work with increasing speed, forming partnerships with indigenous communities who understand the rhythms of these landscapes better than any map can show. Elders point to subtle rises in the ground, shifts in vegetation, or seasonal water flows that hint at structures below. Drone pilots scan threatened regions, hoping to document patterns before the land changes. Environmental scientists track how forest loss affects the preservation of ancient soils and earthworks. These efforts blend modern tools with ancestral knowledge, each depending on the other to safeguard what remains. Yet protection is not simple. Some sites lie within regions pressured by economic need. Others exist in areas difficult to access or legally vulnerable. The challenge is not only to uncover history, but to ensure that its last traces endure long enough to be understood. Without careful stewardship, the stories that resurfaced after centuries of obscurity may once again vanish, this time not to nature, but to our own speed and appetite. The serenity of this realization contrasts with the weight it carries. History is fragile. Landscapes shift. Memories fade. What survives depends on what we choose to protect. And with this delicate balance acknowledged, the journey moves toward its final reflections, the legacy of rediscovery, and what it means for how we understand ourselves in the vast timeline of the human story. The Amazon has long been described as a force that erases, a green tide that swallows every trace of what once stood beneath its canopy. Yet, as the hidden landscapes of ancient cities come into focus, another interpretation emerges, one quieter, more tender. The forest did not simply consume the past. It preserved it, layer by layer, root by root. It folded human stories into its own body, not destroying them, but guarding them until the world was finally ready to see. In this sense, the forest becomes less a destroyer and more a historian, one who writes in soil, archives in vegetation, and reveals its records only when the tools exist to read them. Earthworks, softened by centuries, still form the outlines of plazas. Patterns in enriched soil trace the boundaries of gardens and homes. Groves of fruit trees, arranged too deliberately to be natural, whisper of hands that tended them. Even the distribution of species across vast stretches of land hints at choices made long ago, choices the forest carried forward into the present. These traces are like fragments of sentences from a language nearly lost, each one telling a piece of the story, each one surviving, because the canopy shielded it from wind, fire, and conquest. There is a poetic contradiction at the heart of this discovery. What the forest erased from sight, it protected from harm. What it concealed beneath roots, it kept intact beneath shadow. The very forces that hid the ancient Amazonian world also preserved it. Perhaps this is why the rediscovery feels less like a triumph of technology and more like a moment of timing and unfolding. History did not arrive because we forced it into view. It surfaced because the forest allowed it. For late-night listeners, this realization settles softly. The past is not static. It does not exist only in ruins or records. It lingers in landscapes, in ecosystems, in patterns too subtle for earlier generations to notice. The Amazon's memory was never empty. We simply lacked the language to read it. And with the forest now speaking in new ways, the story extends beyond archaeology. It turns toward us, toward the meaning of rediscovery, and the responsibility carried by anyone who glimpses a world once thought impossible. The next section explores the story we now carry forward, and what it means to inherit a past, revealed only in our time. As the contours of the ancient Amazonian world come into focus, the lessons they offer begin to shimmer through the leaves. These lessons are not wrapped in grand monuments or carved inscriptions. They rise instead from patterns in soil, from the flow of rivers, from the resilience of orchards that outlived the hands that planted them. Their story invites a different way of seeing one, grounded in humility. For centuries, the absence of ruins convinced us that nothing remarkable had happened here. Now we learn that the forest was not empty, but full of knowledge we had forgotten how to notice. Their world teaches resilience through cooperation rather than domination. They endured by shaping landscapes that fed both people and ecosystems. by building networks flexible enough to bend with change, by choosing materials that return to the earth rather than resisting it. Their approach shows that civilization does not require permanence to be sophisticated, nor conquest to be powerful. In their choices, we glimpse alternatives to modern narratives of progress, alternatives rooted not in extraction, but in reciprocity. These discoveries also remind us of curiosity's importance. The tools that revealed ancient cities existed for decades before anyone thought to use them this way. Likewise, oral histories preserved fragments of truth that only now align with scientific evidence. Listening to landscapes, to technology, to communities, allows stories to surface that would otherwise remain hidden. The Amazonian past demonstrates that understanding emerges when we accept that the world is older, deeper, and more intertwined than we often imagine. For late-night listeners, the reflection settles gently. We are not separate from this long continuum of human experience. We are part of it, shaped by the same instincts to adapt, create, and seek meaning. These rediscovered cities expand our sense of ancestry, inviting us to honor the ingenuity of people whose names have faded, but whose influence still shapes the forest around them. And perhaps the most important lesson is this: history is fragile. It survives only when we choose to see it, protect it, and allow it to guide us. The story of the Amazonian civilizations could have vanished entirely. Instead, it returned at the moment we were finally prepared to understand it. From this shared understanding, the narrative turns toward the viewer's role, what it means to carry these revelations forward into the world beyond the forest. As the story of the Amazon's forgotten cities unfolds, it becomes clear that rediscovery does not bring the mystery to a close. Instead, it opens a wider horizon. The outlines revealed beneath the forest canopy are not final answers, but echoes gentle reminders that human achievement is far older, more diverse, and more resilient than our narrow records suggest. The past, once assumed to be silent here, rises with unexpected clarity, asking not for admiration, but for understanding. In these shapes and soils, we see not only what was lost, but what we nearly failed to notice. The narration returns to the mood of quiet landscapes. Aerial views drift over treetops that conceal plazas once filled with voices. Rivers glide past the traces of causeways that carried footsteps now long forgotten. Everything feels suspended between presence and absence. The forest breathes over the remnants, neither fully yielding them nor fully hiding them. It is as if history itself moves in cycles, emerging, fading, and emerging again when the moment is right. What gives these revelations their emotional weight is their suggestion that knowledge is not linear. It can vanish in a generation, persist in memory, and return centuries later in the form of new questions. Civilizations rise, decline, and transform. The land absorbs their stories, holding them softly until curiosity aligns with the right tools. The rediscovery of the Amazon feels less like uncovering something old and more like awakening to something continuous, a conversation that never truly ended, only shifted into silence for a time. This section invites reflection. What does it mean for us to find these echoes now? They reveal not just what ancient people achieved, but what humans are capable of when we work with landscapes rather than against them, when we allow culture and environment to shape one another. These rediscovered cities whisper of creativity, adaptability, and balance qualities as relevant to the future as they were to the past. For late-night listeners, the feeling that lingers is one of gentle possibility. Rediscovery is not simply about filling gaps in history. It is about recognizing the cycles of forgetting and remembering that define our species. The echo of the Green Kingdom did not end, it waited. And with that awareness, the story moves toward its final reflection. How we choose to carry these echoes forward, and what they might ask of us in the centuries to come. As the rediscovered cities settle once more into the quiet rhythm of the forest, the story they left behind becomes something we must hold with care. These were worlds that did not simply end, they transformed. Homes became hollows in the earth, roads became lines traced by roots. Ceremonial grounds softened into curves that only the sky could read. The people who shaped them did not vanish from memory. By failure they dissolved into the land they had tended, their legacy woven into soil, species, and rivers. What remains is not a ruin, but an echo carried forward in the living forest. In this closing moment, the narration slows, allowing the weight of that transformation to settle gently. The Amazonian cities remind us that impermanence is not loss. It is another form of continuity. A society that becomes a forest is not erased. It becomes part of a larger story, one that stretches beyond centuries and beyond the limits of written history. Their knowledge lives in engineered soils still fertile today, in orchards that continue to bear fruit, in the geometric foundations that persist beneath leaves as quiet signatures of intention. Every new LiDAR scan, every excavation, every indigenous narrative reclaimed brings another piece of this world back into view. The rediscovery is ongoing, not a single revelation but 1,000 small openings, moments when the past leans forward and allows itself to be seen. And with each discovery, we are reminded that history breathes. It shifts, returns, and waits patiently for us to learn how to listen. For late-night listeners, drifting on the edge of thought and sleep, the story ends not with a closed door, but with a soft invitation. The forest is still speaking. Its patterns invite curiosity. Its silences ask for respect. Its memories offer guidance. What we recover now is not merely information, but relationship. A renewed connection to landscapes shaped by hands, long gone, yet still present in every curve of earth and every cluster of trees. The narrative settles into a final stillness, offering closure without finality. Like the civilizations it describes, the story does not end, it changes shape. It becomes something the viewer carries quietly into the night, a reminder that the past is never as distant as it seems, and that some mysteries return only when we are finally willing to hear them.